terrible accident has left the Deadliest catch family grieving a devastating loss. One of their bravest fishermen paid the ultimate price in the dangerous fight against the sea. The crew was caught in a deadly storm, and what started as a routine haul quickly turned into a fight for survival. How could something so routine turn so tragic? Let us uncover what really happened in those terrifying final moments that will make you fear the ocean like never before. With almost 60 pots already pulled and loaded, Jake's crew thought they were heading toward a huge payday. They pushed further northwest than ever, gambling for the motherlode of crabs, and it worked. The nets were fuller than anyone dared to dream, easily 200, maybe 300 crabs in a single haul. For a few hours, it felt like all their hard work had finally paid off. Then, the weather turned fast. The wind picked up, the rain turned sideways, and what was once a promising day quickly became a life-and-death struggle. They knew they had to hurry, finish their work, and return home to their families. But it wasn't just the wind, something else was about to go terribly wrong. Before we go any further, it's clear this accident was far more devastating than anyone could have prepared for. And what came next will leave you completely stunned. Captain Jake's excitement turned to worry as a strange beep echoed from the sonar. It wasn't a sound they were used to, and it got everyone's attention. Jake knew the sonar signals well enough to understand that when something feels wrong, you don't ignore it. He ordered his crew to prepare for the worst. That anchor cable needed to stay tight, or the winch could rip clean off the ship, which would spell disaster. Jake's hands were tied. His main concern now was trying to keep everyone safe. The situation on deck went from bad to worse in no time. The rain was relentless, the waves smashing the boat like a giant's fist. Jake gave orders like a man trying to outshout the storm itself. The most dangerous spot on deck became the winch. If the cable snapped, anyone standing near it would be in serious trouble, and Jake's warnings grew more desperate. One of the deckhands almost went overboard when the cable got caught, jerking suddenly. It was the kind of moment that made everyone freeze in terror for a split second. They had all seen enough men go overboard to know that it was often the last anyone ever saw of them. Then, as if the sea wasn't trouble enough, another ship came creeping dangerously close. It was the Wizard. Captain Jake had seen her many times before, but not like this, not this close, and not in a storm like this. It seemed like a collision was unavoidable. The crews of both ships braced for impact, and you could feel the panic. The waves heaved, and the two vessels barely missed crashing into each other. But while they avoided a direct hit, it was close enough to leave everyone rattled. Jake couldn't deal with the Wizard's captain right then. He had a whole crew relying on him to make the right decisions, to get them back to port in one piece. But no matter how experienced a captain you are, there are moments when the ocean just doesn't care. One wrong move, one slip on the wet deck, and tragedy strikes. A crew member lost his footing, and the next thing anyone knew, he was gone. The freezing cold of the Bering Sea swallowed him up in seconds, and the crew could only stare in horror. They pulled up a haul bigger than anything they'd seen before, but it didn't matter anymore. In one heart-stopping moment, the reality of their dangerous life came crashing back. Jake and his crew knew they had to keep going, but the mood on the ship had darkened. The high of catching so many crabs meant nothing compared to the low of losing a man. Jake tried to keep them moving, shouting orders, keeping them focused, but everyone knew something had changed. Each wave that hit the ship felt like it was mocking them. When you're at sea, you don't have time to process grief. You have to keep moving, keep working, and hope you make it back to land. But then, just as they tried to wrap up and head back, something else caught Jake's attention. Another strange noise from below. Not the anchor. Not the cable. But something else entirely. The sea was playing tricks, and whatever was going on down there, it wasn't good. Jake had to make a call. Should they stick around and figure out what was happening, or cut their losses and get home before something worse happened? The crew waited for his decision, each of them knowing that the wrong move could mean more than just losing crabs, it could mean losing more lives. Meanwhile, the Wizard's captain was furious. He knew his ship had barely escaped a collision, and his frustration boiled over as he shouted into the radio, questioning Jake's decisions. The two captains exchanged words, but the tension was clear. There was no room for error, not in these conditions, and definitely not when lives were on the line. The Bering Sea wasn't forgiving, and neither were the men who sailed it. The crew thought the worst was over, but another storm was already coming, one that would push their strength and courage to the edge. Back on the Wizard, the crew dealt with the aftermath of the near collision. The captain tried to calm his men down, explaining that they'd done the best they could under the circumstances. It was a close call, but they'd avoided a complete disaster. At least, for now. But the real storm wasn't just outside, it was also in the minds of the crew, who now had to face the fact that their job was more dangerous than they ever wanted to admit. Every man there knew that the sea didn't play favorites. Today, it was Jake's crew. Tomorrow, it could be theirs. The calm that followed didn't last long. Another wave hit, and this time, it almost took Jacob, one of Jake's deckhands, overboard. He managed to grab onto the railing just in time, pulling himself back on deck, but it was too close. Jacob's face was pale, his hands shaking, but he forced a smile. That's what they did. They laughed off the fear because if you didn't, it would eat you alive. Captain Jake knew it, too. He shouted an apology, but Jacob waved it off, though everyone could see just how shaken he really was. And then came the next challenge. Over on the Summer Bay, Captain Wild Bill faced his own crisis when a crew member went overboard in the middle of hauling their pots. A man slipped, and before anyone could react, he was in the freezing water. The crew acted fast, pulling him back on board, but the damage was done. The shock of the icy water left the man shivering, barely able to stand, but they knew they couldn't stop. They had to keep working, but they also knew they'd dodged a bullet. The Bering Sea doesn't often give second chances. Captain Jake. Captain Wild Bill. Captain Keith. Captain Harley. Each of them had faced challenges that week that pushed them to their limits. They'd lost a man, nearly collided, battled the elements, and somehow, they kept going. It wasn't about the crabs anymore. It was about survival. The Bering Sea is a cruel place, and the men who fish its waters know that better than anyone. They go out there for the thrill, for the money, for the chance to prove themselves. But sometimes, the cost is too high. Captain Jake knew that, as did every other captain who'd been out there long enough. The sea doesn't give second chances. And when it does, you count yourself lucky and move on. They'd all seen enough to know that you take what the sea gives, and you keep moving, because stopping means you're done. But the challenges weren't over yet. As the Cornelia Marie continued on, Captain Josh had to navigate through an area known for its unpredictable underwater currents. The sea below was a maze of currents that could pull the boat off course in seconds. The navigation instruments were working overtime, and the crew had to stay on high alert. The deckhands were exhausted, their muscles aching from a constant battle with the equipment and the sea. But there was no room for rest. Josh knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake, not in these waters. The waves grew bigger, crashing against the hull and sending icy spray across the deck. Captain Casey kept his eyes on the instruments, watching the depth gauge as they moved through the treacherous waters. One wrong move, and they could end up grounded on an unseen reef, or worse, flipped by an underwater current they hadn't anticipated. The tension on the deck was palpable, every man knowing that their fate rested on the captain's decisions and the reliability of their instruments. Suddenly, the boat lurched to one side. Josh grabbed the wheel, fighting to keep them steady. A powerful current had caught them, pulling the boat dangerously off course. The crew scrambled to adjust, their hearts pounding as the deck tilted under their feet. Casey shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and waves. They had to counter the current, fight against the pull, or risk being dragged into even more dangerous waters. The crew moved like a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his role and executing it with precision. They adjusted the lines, balanced the pots, and worked to steady the ship. It was moments like these that defined a crew, how they reacted when everything seemed to be going wrong. And somehow, they managed it. The boat slowly righted itself, the instruments stabilizing, and Josh let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had made it through. But the relief was short-lived. The sea didn't give them time to celebrate.